And I recently just finished reading a historical novel. And this novel is about a 16-year-old girl way back in when Australia was first discovered by white men. And she was convicted in England for stealing some black lace. So she was sentenced to prison for stealing some lace. And as part of this sentence, she was then sentenced to transportation on the first fleet as a convict to Australia to serve out her remaining term. Now, what I found interesting about this girl is that she was actually Jewish. And what I found more interesting about this girl was that her name is Esther. So I just want to read an excerpt from the introduction from Esther. And it says this: "This is the story of a remarkable woman. Arriving in New South Wales as a convict on the first fleet, Esther Abrahams rose, like Cinderella herself, from the very bottom of society to its top. She had none of the advantages of education and social standing enjoyed by her contemporary, Elizabeth MacArthur, who was New South Wales First Lady, and yet she had achieved similar success in the management of a large agricultural estate." It goes on to say, "People make history. And it is not until we get to know the people behind historic events that we really understand what they were all about." Esther's life was intertwined with all the major events of the early colony, and so, through her, we meet the principal figures of the time, both British and Indigenous, and see how their interrelationships influenced the historical outcomes. Now, after reading this book, I realised how little I actually know about Australia's history. So if you want to brush up on your history, I really highly recommend this book. But that's not our message today. People make history. And just like Esther Abrahams, a once 16-year-old convict sentenced to transportation on the first fleet, who became one of New South Wales' first ladies, Hadassah, more commonly known as Esther, not only became Queen of Persia, but she changed the course of history for herself and for her Jewish people. So as I said, I thought maybe it was quite fitting on this Queen's birthday long weekend that we should take a look at another queen, being Queen Esther from the Bible. Now, there's two facts about the book of Esther that I want to remind you of. So firstly, Esther is only one of two books in the entire Bible named after and about a woman, with the other being Ruth. And it is the only book in the Bible where you will not find one single mention of God's name in any way, shape or form. God is completely absent, as in not named, in this book of Esther. Now, you are probably familiar with the book of Esther if, for no other reason than a very infamous line from Mordecai, who's Esther's guardian. And we find this in chapter 4, verse 14 of Esther. "For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this." That's that really famous line, "for such a time as this." Now, some context and some background of where we are in the book of Esther. So the book of Esther is about 100 years after the exile to Babylon. In 538 BC, King Cyrus of Persia issues a decree which allows the Jewish exiles to return to their ancestral home. However, Mordecai and his ward Esther choose not to obey the command, choosing instead to remain in Persia. So, I thought, sticking with our literature theme this morning, we'd have a look at some of the main characters. So we have our protagonist, who is Esther. We have our antagonist, or our villain, who's Haman, and we have our supporting characters, Mordecai, King Xerxes, and Queen Vashti. And it's through these interwoven relationships of these 5 people that Esther saves the Jewish people. And we see, even though God's name is never mentioned in the book, we see God's hand at work through the events that take place. Because there are far too many coincidences, too many opportunities throughout this book for God to be absent. Because God is always active and he is always at work for the benefit of those he loves. And Esther is yet another example of how God uses the least suspecting person, the person that we would least suspect, to carry out his plan and his purpose. God continually defies the order of man. Esther, unqualified. She comes from the wrong family. She comes from the wrong heritage. She's from the wrong background. She probably doesn't have any of the necessary skills and attributes and qualities that are required to perform the position that she is chosen for. But there's a lot that we can take away from the book of Esther, and not just from the main protagonist, Esther herself. So we're going to look at 3 lessons today that we're going to take away from Esther. And the first lesson is this: stick with the wise and don't let your emotions rule. So we're actually going to read Esther chapter 1, verses 10 to 19. So it says, on the 7th day of the feast, when King Xerxes was in high spirits because of the wine, he told the 7 eunuchs who attended him to bring Queen Vashti to him with the royal crown on her head. He wanted the nobles and all the other men to gaze on her beauty, for she was a very beautiful woman. But when they conveyed the king's order to Queen Vashti, she refused to come. This made the king furious, and he burned with anger. He immediately consulted with his wise advisers, who knew all the Persian laws and customs, for he always asked their advice. They met with the king regularly and held the highest positions in the empire. What must be done to Queen Vashti, the king demanded. What penalty does the law provide for a queen who refuses to obey the king's orders, properly sent through his eunuchs? Memucan answered the king and his nobles, Queen Vashti has wronged not only the king, but also every noble and citizen throughout your empire. Women everywhere will begin to despise their husbands when they learn that Queen Vashti has refused to appear before the king. Before this day is out, the wives of all the king's nobles throughout Persia and Media will hear what the queen did and will start treating their husbands the same way. There will be no end to their contempt and anger. So if it please the king, we suggest that you issue a written decree, a law of the Persians and the Medes that cannot be revoked. It should order that Queen Vashti be forever banished from the presence of King Xerxes, and that the king should choose another queen more worthy than she. The outrage! Oh my gosh! What's going to happen? Because Queen Vashti defied King Xerxes' order. Gosh, the women are going to just, revolt. It's going to be terrible. Xerxes acted from a place of anger and of pride. He took advice from people who didn't have his best interests at heart, didn't have the kingdom's interests at heart. They had their own best interests at heart. Banishing Vashti was not to benefit the king or because she had committed some horrendous crime. It was because they were afraid of what was going to happen to them and their positions. Now, I was a little bit like Xerxes, not in terms of, banishing people, but, making rash decisions from a place of anger, which ultimately comes down to making decisions out of anger and pride. Because why? Because I wasn't getting my own way. Recently, I'll share an example. So recently, my husband and I were having a discussion about some stuff, and I won't go into the details because it's not important. Anyway, afterwards, I said to him, aren't you so proud of me? Like, I can't write down in about half an hour. Like it did not take me a whole week of going through it over and over in my mind and replaying the situation to calm myself down and make a decision, not from a place of anger or pride, but just from a place of wisdom and love. So it points to me. Yay! And points to my husband for putting up with me so long. There we go. Another thing about Xerxes. Now, when Xerxes made the decision to banish Vashti, I reckon he was probably still intoxicated because he had probably close to a 6-month-long party. I mean, it was a 180-day celebration to show off his opulent wealth. Like he wanted to show all his shiny, pretty things off to everybody so everybody could see how wealthy he was. And that was followed, so we had the 180-day celebration, that was followed by a 7-day banquet at which, and it says in Esther, at which there was no limit to the amount of beverages one man would have. So, not only was Xerxes acting out of a place of pride and anger, but he was probably still half intoxicated. You know, too much of a good thing can be too much. As you read through Esther, it's obvious that she respects Mordecai and values his wisdom. We see that Esther is obedient. She is compliant. She is cooperative. She is humble. She is intelligent. And she is patient. And in Esther chapter 2, verse 15, we read, "When it was Esther's turn to go to the king, she accepted the advice of Haggai, who, again, here we see God's hand. Earlier in chapter 2, we learn that Esther found favour with Haggai, who was the person who was responsible for her, the eunuch in charge of the harem. She asked for nothing except what he suggested, and she was admired by everyone who saw her. You see, unlike Xerxes, Esther didn't act from a place of anger or pride or contempt or selfish ambition. Unlike Esther, she relied on advice from wise people who were not acting in their own best interest either. All right, so lesson 2, never act from a place of offence. Now, selfish ambition may get you what you want for a short time, but eternity, as the word would suggest, is forever. You know, it's without end. Haman's plans for self-promotion, which we'll read about later on in Esther, which would come about at the expense of an entire race's demise, ultimately was the cause of his own demise. Now, Haman was an Agagite. So Agagites are descendants of the ancient Canaanites. And if you want a little recap on the Canaanites, they practiced worship of demonic idols, taboo sexual acts, and the kicker, they sacrificed their own children to their gods. You know, the land of Canaan is the land that God promised to give to Abraham and his descendants. So it's really not hard to see why Haman is the villain in this story. We're going to read Esther chapter 3, verse 16. Esther chapter 3, verses 1 to 6. So sometime later, King Xerxes promoted Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, over all the other nobles, making him the most powerful official in the empire. All the king's officials would bow down before Haman to show him respect whenever he passed by, for so the king had commanded. But Mordecai refused to bow down or show him respect. Then the palace officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, "Why are you disobeying the king's command?" They spoke to him day after day, but he still refused to comply with the order. So they spoke to Haman about this to see if he would tolerate Mordecai's conduct, since Mordecai had told them he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not bow down or show him respect, he was filled with rage. He had learned of Mordecai's nationality, so he decided it was not enough to lay hands on Mordecai alone. Instead, he looked for a way to destroy all the Jews throughout the entire empire of Xerxes. Proverbs 16:9 says, we can make our plans, but the Lord determines our steps. Haman had grand plans for his own life, which all involved power and wealth. And he used his position of authority to manipulate King Xerxes into agreeing to the annihilation of an entire group of people. Why? Ultimately, because Haman was offended, because Mordecai would not bow down to him and show him the respect he thought he deserved. Now, the definition of offence is annoyance or resentment brought about by a perceived insult to or disregard for oneself. And that's what Haman had. So let's see what happens when Haman acts from a place of offence. And in Esther chapter 7, verses 1 to 10, it says, So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet. On this second occasion, while they were drinking wine, the king again said to Esther, Tell me what you want, Queen Esther. What is your request? I will give it to you, even if it is half the kingdom. Queen Esther replied, If I have found favour with the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my request, I ask that my life and the lives of my people will be spared. For my people and I have been sold to those who would kill, slaughter, and annihilate us. If we had merely been sold as slaves, I could remain quiet. For that would be too trivial a matter to warrant disturbing the king. Who would do such a thing? King Xerxes demanded. Who would be so presumptuous as to touch you? Esther replied, This wicked Haman is our adversary and our enemy. Haman grew pale with fright before the king and queen. Then the king jumped to his feet in a rage and went out into the palace garden. Haman, however, stayed behind to plead for his life with Queen Esther, for he knew that the king intended to kill him. In despair, he fell on the couch where Queen Esther was reclining, just as the king was returning from the palace garden. How coincidental. The king exclaimed, Will he even assault the queen right here in the palace before my very eyes? As soon as the king spoke, his attendants covered Haman's face, signalling his doom. Then Harbona, one of the king's eunuchs, said, Haman has set up a sharpened pole that stands 75 feet tall in his own courtyard. He intended to use it to impale Mordecai, the man who saved the king from assassination. Then impale him on it, the king ordered. So they impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai, and the king's anger subsided. Did God orchestrate what happened in Persia between King Xerxes and Queen Vashti in order for a Jewish girl in a Persian empire to win a beauty contest, gain the favour of the king, save her people from genocide, and, as a little bonus, get her father Mordecai the most powerful position aside from the king in all of Persia? Well, I don't think so. In Romans chapter 8, verse 28, it says, And we know that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose for them. So, I don't think God orchestrated all of this, but God's hand was certainly active. He placed favour over Esther and Mordecai, and it ultimately benefited the Jewish people. All right, Esther's story could have turned out very different. And our last lesson this morning is sometimes you've just got to do it afraid. So if we look back at chapter 4, verse 14, where it says, For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Esther had witnessed firsthand the favour of God on her life. In addition to this, Esther had a loving and wise earthly father figure who believed God was faithful and could be trusted. Armed with this knowledge, we see Esther's reply. Esther chapter 4, verse 15 to 17 says, Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai, Go and gather together all the Jews of Susa and fast for me. My maids and I will do the same. And then, though it is against the law, I will go in to see the king. If I must die, I must die. So Mordecai went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. Now, spoiler alert, We already know that everything works out in the favour of the Jewish people, and Esther wasn't beheaded for approaching the king uninvited. 1 John 5:14-15 says, "And we are confident that he hears us whenever we ask for anything that pleases him. And since we know he hears us when we make our requests, we also know that he will give us what we ask for." You know, as Christians, we have access to a boldness and a confidence that puzzles those who do not know our Saviour. You know, have you ever found yourself being asked by people who are not Christians questions like, "Well, why aren't you panicking? Well, aren't you worried? You know, are you not stressing out? How can you not be so stressed? How can you be so calm? Aren't you afraid?" And my answer is sometimes, yes, to all. Sometimes I do worry. Sometimes I do panic. Sometimes I am stressed out. Sometimes I'm not so calm. Sometimes I am afraid. But then I remind myself that I don't need to be any of those things, because I have the confidence in the knowledge that my God will come through, that my God is faithful, that his word can be trusted, and that Jesus made a way for all of us. So just to close my message this morning, I just have a final note. So we've looked at Esther, our protagonist. We've looked at Haman, our villain or our antagonist. But, you know, there's a few other supporting characters in this story of Esther. And I really encourage you, it's quite a short book. I think it's only, it's 10 chapters. Like, seriously, read it this afternoon. You know, Mordecai really played a really important supporting character to Esther. You know, he was an excellent role model. He was a loving father. He was faithful to God. He risked his own life. In chapter 2, verses 21-23, we see where Mordecai goes to report to Esther that he's overheard an assassination plot against the king. Now, he could have been killed himself for doing that, but he risked his own life to do that. And, you know, it doesn't matter what part you have to play. It doesn't matter if you feel like you're the main character or if you're just a mere supporting character. We are all important in the story of God. And Mordecai was certainly rewarded for his part. And in chapter 10 it says, "King Xerxes imposed a tribute throughout his empire, even to the distant coastlands. His great achievements and the full account of the greatness of Mordecai, whom the king had promoted and recorded in the book of the history of the kings of Media and Persia. Mordecai the Jew became the prime minister, with authority next to that of King Xerxes himself. He was very great among the Jews, who held him in high esteem, because he continued to work for the good of his people and to speak up for the welfare of all of their descendants." So we all have a very important part to play in God's plan and God's purpose. And we have that confidence and that boldness that we can step out knowing that God's word is true and God is faithful. So church, would you just join me as we pray this morning? Lord God, we just thank you that we can step out in boldness and in confidence because of your word, Lord God, because your word isn't just words in a book. You know, it's not just thoughts written by a man. Lord God, these are your thoughts and your words, Lord God. These are historical events that have happened, Lord God. And these are words of things that will come, Father God. So I just ask that as we go about our week, Father God, you know, you would give us the boldness and the confidence to step out trusting in your name, Lord God, that we would be open to receiving a word from you, Lord God. You know, if there's somebody around us who needs encouragement, Lord God, I just pray that we would be open to receiving a nudge from the Holy Spirit to take that step and to have a conversation with that person that needs encouragement, Lord God. In Jesus' name we pray, amen.